Hello. In this video we're going to talk about the Commerce Clause and how the legal case of Pike versus Bruce Church changes the meaning of the Commerce Clause from a limitation of state power to a means of protecting state businesses from burdensome state commerce laws. But before we talk about the case, we need to talk about the Commerce Clause itself. The Commerce Clause is written in the United States Constitution, and like the Constitution, more broadly speaking, sets forth the relationship the government will have with its people and the states, or in other words, its primary aim is to state its level of authority. The clause comes from Section 8 of the Constitution and reads as follows. The Constitution shall have power to, and it says, to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and within the Indian tribes. Now, what's important about this is both what is said and implied. Essentially what is said is that the federal government has the authority to regulate trade among the states, as well as a list of other things, but also that what is implied is that the states do not have the authority to do so. Because of this, we have what's called the Dormant Commerce Clause, which an explanation of this is stated by the Constitution Annotated, which says, the Supreme Court has identified two principles that animate its modern Dormant Commerce Clause analysis. First, subject to certain exceptions, states may not discriminate against interstate commerce. Second, states may not take actions that are financially neutral but unduly burden interstate commerce. So essentially how the modern Commerce Clause plays out is that states can't promote their trade over interstate trade or burden interstate trade through their regulations. Now, from what we have explained so far, all the Commerce Clause really just seems to be about is defining the state and federal authority on trade and essentially being a regulation on what would be called state favoritism to trade. But the case that we're about to show kind of gives a new context to it. In 1970, a case was presented to the Supreme Court known as Pike versus Bruce Church. The case itself originated in a district court but was then brought forth by Bruce Church to the Supreme Court. Bruce Church, Inc. would grow cantaloupes in Arizona and would ship unpackaged cantaloupes to California. In California, they would be packaged and become ready to sell. So essentially, this is a case of interstate trade because the cantaloupes are being shipped from Arizona to California in order to be sold. So Commerce Clause rules will apply. Now, this method clashed with an Arizona law that required all cantaloupes grown in the state to be packaged there before leaving it. Essentially, Arizona wanted to have marketing for its produce, and so the packaging law was essentially there to enforce that. Pike, who was a government agent responsible for enforcing the law, ordered Bruce Church to cease using its current transportation method. Bruce Church argued that the law violated the Dormant Commerce Clause doctrine by imposing a burden on interstate commerce. It claimed that it would need to spend roughly $200,000 to build and operate a packaging facility in Arizona in order to comply with that law. The lower court granted an injunction against the enforcement of the law, and the Supreme Court would affirm this case, stating that the appellate's order burdens interstate commerce since the cantaloupes were destined to be shipped from Arizona to an ascertainable location in California immediately after harvest. An application of the challenged statute would require an operation now conducted outside the state to be performed within the state so it can be regulated there. The burden on interstate commerce imposed by the appellate's order is unconstitutional since Arizona's minimal interest in identifying the origin of appellee's cantaloupes to enhance the reputation of Arizona producers cannot justify subjugating the appellee to the substantial capital expenditure of building and operating in Arizona a packaging plant that it does not need. Now, to understand the motive behind the court's decision, we can look at the opinions delivered by Justice Stewart, who stated, although criteria for determining the validity of state statutes affecting interstate commerce have been vigorously stated, the general rule that emerges can be phrased as follows. Where the statute regulates even-handedly to effectuate a legitimate local public interest, and its effects on interstate commerce are only incidental, it will be upheld unless the burden imposed on such commerce is clearly excessive in relation to the punitive local benefits. If a legitimate local purpose is found, then the question becomes one of degree, and the extent of burden that will be tolerated will, of course, depend on the nature of the local interest involved and whether it could be promoted, as well with a lesser impact on interstate activities. Occasionally, the court has candidly undertaken a balancing approach in resolving these issues, but more frequently, it has spoken in terms of direct and indirect effects and burdens. So, essentially, this case brought forth an example that the Commerce Clause could also protect state businesses from potentially unfair state regulation, or at least from burdensome regulation. Now, why this is important is that in most examples of applications of the Commerce Clause, it's the state regulations that are impacting outside businesses and creating the issue. So, for example, if it was a California law that was impacting Bruce Church and Arizona company. Those are typically the types of cases you really think of. And because of this, the law had really only been seen as something that defined state authority and was really only benefit to the trade of other states, not your local ones. However, this case did something to redefine the public perception of the law in a way that was previously lacking. In this way, the case of Pike versus Bruce Church really better highlights that public policy side of the Commerce Clause and shows how it can be a means of protecting state businesses from burdensome state commerce laws. In any case, we thank you for watching this video, and we hope this video has been both interesting and enlightening.